In the winter of 1944, as Europe lay frozen in snow and silence, Adolf Hitler launched one last desperate gamble. The Ardennes Offensive, what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, was meant to shatter the Allied armies, divide them, and perhaps turn the war's tide. At first, the Germans laughed, convinced the Americans could not endure the fury of winter warfare. But in the forests and villages of Belgium, George S. Patton's Third Army would march into legend. This is the story of sacrifice, endurance, and a victory written in blood upon the snow. The Winter Gamble. The last months of 1944 brought with them a deceptive sense of calm on the Western Front. After the Allies had broken out of Normandy in the summer, liberated Paris, and driven the Germans back across France, many American and British soldiers believed that victory was only a matter of weeks away. Supplies were being prepared for a push into Germany's industrial heartland, and commanders spoke openly of the possibility that the war in Europe might be over by Christmas. But in the forests of the Ardennes, a region straddling Belgium and Luxembourg, the stage was being set for one of the most ferocious and unexpected battles of the entire war. The Ardennes was known for its rugged terrain, its thick woods, and its narrow, winding roads. In winter, it became a frozen wilderness, blanketed by snow and choked with icy winds. To most Allied planners, it seemed an unlikely place for a major German offensive. They believed it too difficult for tanks to maneuver, too remote for large troop movements, and too well watched by American divisions resting along the front. This very assumption was what Adolf Hitler and his generals counted on. In Berlin, the Nazi leadership knew that Germany was losing the war. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly toward German soil. In the West, Allied armies massed for a decisive strike. Hitler's only hope was to split the Western Allies, weaken their will, and force them into a negotiated peace that might allow Germany to focus all its resources against the Soviets. To achieve this, he conceived a desperate and audacious plan, a massive winter counteroffensive through the Ardennes. Code-named Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The attack would throw nearly 30 divisions, more than 200,000 men, into the snowy forests. Their objective was nothing less than to capture the vital Belgian port of Antwerp, a key supply hub for the Allies. By seizing Antwerp, the Germans hoped to cut the Allied front in two, encircle entire armies, and force political leaders in London and Washington to reconsider their demand for unconditional surrender. The plan was bold, perhaps reckless. It depended on secrecy, on poor weather to ground Allied aircraft, and on the ability of German soldiers to recapture the lightning speed of earlier blitzkrieg campaigns. Yet Hitler was convinced. On the night of December 15th, German troops moved silently into the Ardennes, assembling under the cover of dense forests and snowstorms. At dawn on December 16th, the silence was shattered. German artillery opened up with a massive barrage along an 85-mile front. Thousands of shells screamed through the icy air, crashing down on American positions. The defenders, many of them inexperienced or newly arrived troops, were stunned by the violence. Soon after, German tanks and infantry surged forward. The Ardennes, so quiet and unimportant the day before, was transformed into a battlefield of chaos. Entire American units were caught off guard. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh to the front, was almost annihilated within days. Towns such as St. Vith, Clairvaux, and Houffalize fell to the advancing Germans. Roads clogged with retreating American vehicles. Prisoners were marched off in long columns, their faces pale against the snow. To the soldiers who survived the initial onslaught, it seemed as though the enemy had returned with the full force of 1940. German morale soared. Officers and soldiers alike believed that this was their chance to turn the tide, to humiliate the Americans and British who had grown complacent. Some German troops even mocked the Americans, claiming they would never be able to fight effectively in the bitter cold of a European winter. They laughed at the thought of soft soldiers from across the Atlantic holding back hardened Wehrmacht veterans. But as the initial shock gave way to stubborn resistance, those laughs would begin to fade. While chaos spread across the American front, one man watched events with cold calculation. General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army. Known as Old Blood and Guts, Patton had built a reputation for speed, aggression, and relentless energy. His soldiers respected him, even feared him, for he demanded discipline and gave little tolerance for weakness. But they also trusted him, for Patton had led them to victory before, across North Africa, Sicily, and France. When reports of the German offensive reached his headquarters, Patton understood immediately what was at stake. The Germans were not merely launching a spoiling attack. This was an all-out gamble to crush the Allied advance. If the Americans did not respond quickly, the front could collapse, and the war could be prolonged indefinitely. The problem was speed. The snow was deep, the roads narrow and icy, and the Germans had seized the initiative. But Patton had long prepared for contingencies. He believed in always planning 3 moves ahead, anticipating the enemy before they struck. In this moment, that foresight would prove invaluable. The Ardennes campaign, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. In the coming weeks, tens of thousands would die in frozen forests and villages. Soldiers would endure nights without food or fire, shells bursting among the trees, and machine gun fire echoing across snow-covered hills. And in that crucible of fire and ice, Patton's Third Army would march north, determined to meet the challenge. For now, though, the Germans advanced with confidence, believing they had seized the upper hand. They mocked their enemies, amused at the thought of Americans freezing in foxholes. What they did not yet realize was that this winter gamble would cost them dearly, and that soon the snow of the Ardennes would be stained red with blood. foxholes filled with slush and ice, their boots stiff with frost, their hands numb around their weapons. Medical units struggled to care for the wounded in makeshift basements and barns. Civilians, caught in the middle, huddled in cellars as shells exploded above. On December 22nd, a German delegation approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a letter demanding the surrender of Bastogne. The defenders passed the note to their acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. Reading it, McAuliffe chuckled. His written reply was just one word: nuts. When the German officers expressed confusion, the Americans explained, it meant go to hell. The defenders would not surrender. The siege of Bastogne became a symbol of American resilience. Outnumbered 5-1, with little food and almost no ammunition, the paratroopers and tankers held their ground. They knew reinforcements had to come. They knew Patton's army was on the move. The question was whether he could reach them in time. Patton pressed his men onward. Every hour counted. He urged his officers, keep moving, damn it. We're going to relieve Bastogne. His staff worked around the clock, coordinating movements, ensuring supplies reached the front, and maintaining order across the miles of columns. To inspire his troops, Patton even composed a now-famous prayer for better weather, asking God to clear the skies so Allied aircraft could fly again. Sir, the prayer read, grant us fair weather for battle. By December 23rd, the weather did indeed begin to clear. American planes roared into the skies, dropping supplies into Bastogne and strafing German convoys. The defenders cheered as crates of ammunition and food fell from the heavens. At the same time, Patton's lead elements were drawing closer, grinding their way north through snow and fire. The Germans, confident in their encirclement, began to sense danger. Their initial laughter, their mocking of the Americans' ability to fight in winter, was fading. They had underestimated their enemy. For in the depths of that frozen landscape, the Third Army was coming, and with it, the resolve of an entire nation. The snow turns red. By December 22, 1944, the men of the U.S. Third Army were pressing hard through the Ardennes. Their commander, George S. Patton, demanded speed and aggression. Every delay risked disaster for the besieged garrison at Bastogne. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne had already endured nearly a week of isolation, surrounded by superior German forces, battered by artillery, starved of supplies, and frozen in foxholes that offered little protection from the bitter cold. Patton's men knew that time was life, and every mile they gained meant one step closer to their trapped comrades. The terrain they faced was merciless. Heavy snow blanketed the forests and roads, slowing vehicles and making every movement hazardous. Convoys slid on icy slopes, tanks bogged down in drifts, and soldiers marched with frostbitten feet that cracked and bled with every step. But they kept moving. The order was clear. Bastogne must be reached, no matter the cost. German forces were well aware of Patton's advance. Determined to hold their gains, they dug into villages, forests, and ridgelines along the routes of approach. Machine guns were positioned to sweep roads. Artillery zeroed in on crossroads and bridges. The fighting became a brutal contest of will, fought house by house, tree by tree. The Germans were veterans, many of them from the Waffen-SS, and they fought with ferocity. But they were also stretched thin, their supplies dwindling, their fuel reserves critically low. On December 23rd and 24th, the Americans launched repeated assaults along the southern approaches to Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division bore the brunt of the attack, its Shermans grinding forward against German panzers hidden in the woods. Tank battles erupted in snow-covered fields, where visibility was often no more than a few hundred yards. Shells tore through the air, explosions echoing through valleys, sending snow cascading from the trees. Infantrymen advanced behind the tanks, firing rifles and machine guns, hurling grenades into enemy positions. The fighting was savage. At times, combat devolved into close-quarter struggles in barns, cottages, and foxholes. Men fought with bayonets, knives, even entrenching tools, as snow turned crimson with blood. The wounded lay in the frozen earth, calling for medics, while artillery fire thundered around them. Many froze where they fell before help could reach them. German soldiers who had once laughed at the thought of Americans fighting effectively in such weather now realized their mistake. Patton's men showed no sign of breaking. They attacked relentlessly, undeterred by casualties or the cold. Officers drove their units forward, reminding them that thousands of comrades were trapped in Bastogne, relying on them for survival. Christmas Eve 1944 was a night of misery and determination. Soldiers on both sides shivered in the snow, their thoughts drifting to homes and families far away. Some huddled in ruined churches, listening to the distant sounds of carols sung by Belgian villagers, even as shells crashed outside. Others crouched in foxholes, clutching their rifles, waiting for dawn. Patton himself visited forward units, his presence a mixture of inspiration and command. He reminded his men that their task was not only to save Bastogne, but to turn the tide of the entire campaign. On Christmas Day, the Third Army struck with renewed ferocity. The 4th Armored Division, supported by infantry, pushed hard against German positions near Adolf, a village just south of Bastogne. The Germans resisted fiercely, determined to hold the road. Tanks clashed at close range, their steel hulls blazing as armor-piercing shells struck home. Infantry fought through the village, clearing houses one by one. The snow was stained with soot and blood, the air filled with the screams of wounded men and the roar of engines. By the evening of December 26th, the breakthrough came. A spearhead from the 37th Tank Battalion, part of the 4th Armored Division, reached the outer perimeter of Bastogne. As their tanks rolled into the town, they were greeted by weary, mud-streaked paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. Cheers erupted, handshakes and embraces exchanged. The relief of Bastogne was complete. Yet the battle was far from over. While the link had been made, the Germans continued to attack, determined to crush the pocket. Bastogne remained under heavy fire, and the roads in and out were contested by German counterattacks. Still, the psychological impact was enormous. The defenders knew they were no longer alone, and the Germans realized their offensive had stalled. The cost of reaching Bastogne was staggering. Patton's army had suffered thousands of casualties in less than a week of fighting. Entire companies were reduced to handfuls of survivors. Frostbite claimed almost as many men as bullets and shells. Medical stations overflowed with the wounded, their bandages soaked red, their bodies shivering as doctors worked with frozen hands and limited supplies. But the sacrifice had meaning. The road to Bastogne was open, the encirclement broken, and the momentum of the German offensive blunted. For the Germans, who had believed the Ardennes would be their triumph, the reality was sobering. Their tanks were running out of fuel, their infantry exhausted, their timetable shattered. For the Americans, the sight of Patton's tanks rolling into Bastogne became a symbol of hope and determination. Newspapers back home would carry the story, hailing it as a Christmas miracle. In truth, it was the result of hard-marching, brutal fighting, and the unyielding spirit of soldiers who refused to give in, no matter the cold, the blood, or the cost. The snow of the Ardennes, once pristine and silent, had become a graveyard. Bodies lay strewn across fields and forests, frozen in grotesque poses, their faces pale masks beneath steel helmets. Tanks, blackened and burned, littered the roadsides. Trees were shattered by shellfire, their trunks splintered and scarred. The land itself seemed wounded, scarred by the violence of man. And yet, within that frozen hell, victory was taking shape. Patton's gamble had paid off. His relentless drive, his refusal to yield to weather or enemy, had brought salvation to Bastogne. The laughter of the Germans had been silenced, replaced by the grim realization that their last great offensive in the West was doomed. For the soldiers who fought there, the memory would never fade. They would remember the endless march through snow, the screams of comrades, the burning tanks, the white fields turned red. The Ardennes had tested them as nothing else had before, and they had endured. The snow had indeed turned red, and in that blood-stained winter, the fate of the war in Europe had shifted once more in favor of the Allies. Chapter 4: Legacy of Fire and Ice. By the final week of December 1944, the tide of battle in the Ardennes had begun to turn. The German offensive, which had started with such confidence and ferocity, was now running out of momentum. Hitler's gamble had been bold, but it was built on fragile foundations. Poor logistics, dwindling fuel reserves, and the hope that weather and surprise would do what Germany's exhausted army could not. Once Patton's Third Army relieved Bastogne and the skies cleared for Allied air power, the dream of splitting the Western Allies began to collapse. The German High Command had promised their soldiers rapid breakthroughs and swift victories. Instead, panzers stood idle along roadsides, their fuel tanks empty, their crews shivering in the snow. Supply lines stretched too thin, ambushed constantly by Allied fighter bombers once the weather lifted. By January, many German units found themselves retreating through the same frozen forests they had stormed only weeks before, leaving behind wrecked vehicles, abandoned artillery, and the bodies of their fallen comrades. For the Allies, however, the battle was far from over. The Germans fought desperately to salvage their offensive, launching repeated counterattacks in an attempt to retake Bastogne and secure critical crossroads. The Americans, newly reinforced and resupplied, met them blow for blow. Villages changed hands multiple times, their ruins filled with the dead of both sides. Hills and ridgelines, meaningless to the outside world, became scenes of unimaginable sacrifice. The casualty lists grew longer by the day. The Battle of the Bulge would ultimately claim over 80,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, making it the bloodiest single battle ever fought by the United States Army. German losses were even greater, with more than 100,000 men lost, along with thousands of tanks, vehicles, and aircraft that could never be replaced. Civilians in Belgium and Luxembourg also paid a heavy price, as their towns and farms were reduced to rubble, their families displaced or killed in the crossfire. Yet amid this devastation, the actions of the defenders at Bastogne and the men of Patton's Third Army became legend. The 101st Airborne Division, who had held out against overwhelming odds, earned eternal fame for their defiance. Their one-word reply of "nuts" to the German demand for surrender became a rallying cry, a symbol of unyielding spirit. The paratroopers, gaunt and frostbitten, emerged from the siege as heroes, their courage immortalized in history. Patton's army, too, secured its place in the annals of warfare. The Third Army's pivot north, executed with speed and precision under brutal conditions, remains one of the most extraordinary maneuvers in modern military history. Patton himself was lauded, not only for his foresight and aggressive leadership, but for his refusal to accept defeat. When others doubted, he insisted on action. His soldiers, hardened by his relentless discipline, proved capable of enduring the worst that winter and war could offer. For the Germans, the failure of the Ardennes Offensive was catastrophic. It consumed the last reserves of manpower and equipment that could have defended the Reich. The dream of driving the Allies from Western Europe was gone forever. In the months that followed, the German army would be forced into a fighting retreat all the way to the Rhine and beyond, until finally collapsing in May 1945. Hitler had staked his last hope on the Ardennes, and it had been lost in snow and blood. For the men who fought there, the memory lingered long after the guns fell silent. Veterans spoke of nights so cold that rifles froze solid, of comrades who slipped into icy sleep and never awoke, of endless marches through snowfields where every step seemed to sap the will to live. They recalled the sudden flash of artillery, the crack of rifles, the thunder of tanks, and the silence afterward, when the only sound was the wind through shattered trees. They remembered Christmases spent not at home with family, but in ruined villages, crouched beside burning wreckage for warmth, whispering prayers into the freezing night. Many carried those memories in silence for the rest of their lives. The scale of suffering was such that words could scarcely capture it. And yet, the legacy of their sacrifice was clear. Because they endured, the Western Allies held firm. Because they fought, the German advance failed. And because they triumphed in that frozen crucible, the path to ultimate victory in Europe was secured. Historians would later call the Battle of the Bulge the last great German offensive of the war. It was also, in many ways, a test of the American Army's resilience. In that test, the soldiers of Patton's Third Army and the defenders of Bastogne proved equal to the task. They turned an apparent disaster into a triumph, transforming a desperate gamble by Hitler into a decisive failure. The Ardennes remains a place of pilgrimage, where rows of white crosses mark the graves of those who never returned. In towns like Bastogne, memorials stand as reminders of the courage and sacrifice of those who fought. Each winter, when snow falls on those forests and fields, one is reminded of that terrible time when the world held its breath, and men fought not only against each other, but against the elements themselves. The Germans had laughed at first. They believed the Americans would crumble in the face of winter, that they lacked the endurance for such a fight. But the laughter did not last. The snow, once white and pure, had been turned red with blood. Patton's men and the defenders of Bastogne had proven that resolve and sacrifice could overcome even the harshest of odds. In the end, the legacy of the Ardennes was not only one of fire and ice, of tanks and artillery, but of the human spirit. It was a reminder that in the darkest hours, when victory seemed impossible, courage could prevail. And so, the Battle of the Bulge entered history not just as a clash of armies, but as a testament to endurance, a testament written in snow, in blood, and in the unyielding will of those who fought and died there. The laughter of the Germans faded as quickly as the fuel in their tanks. Their last great offensive in the West ended not in triumph, but in ruin. For the Americans, the Ardennes was a crucible of fire and ice, a battle that tested every ounce of courage and endurance. Patton's men turned despair into defiance, and defiance into victory. The snow of the Ardennes remains silent today, but beneath its frozen soil lies the memory of those who fought and fell. Their legacy endures, a reminder that in the darkest of winters, the human spirit can still burn bright.